I'm going to continue with the content. Um, so, um, so Left Voice. Left Voice basically takes this position that that there needs to be work outside of the Democratic Party, and it's very similar to actually Sawant's position. Uh, and I don't really agree with it. I mean, I sort of agree with it, but the big issue I'm going to get to is, and this is what's stated, the author for this article, and this is pretty well promoted, is that the first step to create, let's zoom in on this, the first step to create a viable socialist project in the United States is to recognize the Democratic Party as the enemy down here, as the enemy of the working class, and to invest all of our energies into building a working class independent political tool. But then there's like nothing written about how to create this so-called socialist project, or what is a socialist project. There's nothing about connecting with other people within the Marxist community. There's no talk about having a meeting. You know, like, should we have a meeting? Don't you think so? In the United States, shouldn't maybe Marxists try to have a meeting that's not in a cult, in a sect, in a and should the meeting like not have everybody agree to a terms and conditions of a specific program with a bunch of specific demands? Now, I've called for such a meeting in the past, and most of the Trotskyists, thumbed their nose at me. And then the Marxist-Leninists, of course, also thumbed their nose at me. But I think I can't take you seriously talking about a socialist project when it's just words. You have to have a real alternative. You have to be willing to meet with those people that are willing to meet with you, with comrades. And since my microphone is off, I'll go back. I'll go back to the other articles in a minute. So, revolutionary theory and practice after the end of ideology. So this article is, I read it twice, and I tried pretty closely to try to understand what it was they were trying to get across. And this is also a Left Voice article. And to me, it just didn't seem very concrete, like a very concrete article. And the theory, I didn't see very much actual concrete theory here. Yes, there's a lot of word salad, what I call word salad, but it's not like communicated in a very concrete way, the way I'm communicating right now. And I have an issue when people that have revolutionary politics. Saint Just of Germany. Do you happen to also follow international politics? Yes, I do actually, and I try to. maybe if you have a question about something in international politics that you would like for me to maybe talk about or touch on, and if I don't know anything about the subject, I can of course look it up to give you my opinion at a later time. And there's also the Reddit page below, which I check on a fairly regular basis. If you ever want to make a post there on something internationally that you'd like my opinion on, or the opinion of other people in the Marxist community on, feel free to make a post there, and I'll take a look. Uh, and Yeah, so uh, if you're curious about whatever's going on in the world, I do follow that. The scope of work of the show is primarily on the Marxist community, and I admit it's mainly focused on the United States and Canada, and occasionally we touch on like Great Britain and Australia. But this mostly has to do with the limitations of the English language and our ability to get communiques and statements, etc., by organizations in the Marxist community, uh, which are from non-English speaking countries. Uh, but we did share like Mina's statement, the Middle Eastern uh, socialist statement uh, on Syria and Iran, but that was, of course, posted in English. Um, and we've also shared a few statements from France. Uh, in the future, if there's any translated statements, like definitely you could bring it to our attention. I'd always be interested to read it. And like I said, if it has to do with the Marxist community, I'll be more than happy to give it some time on the show. MR Online has an article on Rosa Luxemburg and using debt as an imperialist instrument. And this is, of course, like taking from the early 20th century. Uh, yes, I'm not super familiar with De Linke as the far left party. Um, I'm familiar with the Green Party. I know that the Green Party in Germany is a little different from the Green Party in the United States. Um, and then Germany also has a long history of the Social Democratic Party of Germany, and which has a long history, and as well as the Communist Party of Germany, right? How's it going, Max Elitenus? And then, of course, Rosa Luxemburg's from Germany. Um, and I think it was not too long ago was the 100th year anniversary of Rosa Luxemburg's death, her murder. Anyway, it's an interesting little summary of her thoughts on this, on basically how capitalists from bigger imperialist countries go to smaller countries and use debt to basically enslave these smaller countries, these smaller colonies and whatnot. Oh, excellent. I had some technical issues with the show. My microphone, I didn't realize it was off for like the first half, unfortunately. I'll re-review one of the articles that was was muted on. I'm doing this show by myself today, and I'm not able to use Skype, so that might have messed up my microphone. I'm using I'm direct porting today because Andrew is sick. I think he's having some health issues. Um, and so while he takes care of that, I'm gonna run the show for today. And of course, Max Lateness, if there's any questions, feel free to ask. I'll try to follow the chat. And and also, if there's any posts or content that you feel is missing that I should cover, that we should cover, um, we have the Reddit page. It's down below. Feel free to make a Reddit post, and you don't have to worry too much about me banning you. I'm not that kind of moderator. I know it's common on Reddit, especially with political Reddits. Uh, and but yeah, if there's content that you want to bring to my attention, to our attention, to have on the show, feel free to contact us through Reddit throughout the week. Um, Slavoj Zizek, yes, he does. He does sometimes identify as a Marxist, I think, or other people identify him as a Marxist sometimes. Uh, he he's a bit of a character, isn't he? Some sometimes I think he says some pretty brilliant things, and then other times it reminds me of like speaking to like a uh, maybe someone with like maybe half his marbles, you know, and or listening to someone with half their marbles, and so sometimes it's just like, is he even listening to himself, you know, or is he just filling the air? Uh, now, yeah, so I don't hold him in the highest regards. I understand he's popular, but if there's something specific by Slavoj Zizek that you think that you want my opinion on, feel free to ask. I don't follow him extremely close. That I think that's a very uh, healthy way to approach Marxism, Max eliteness, is to a healthy way is to approach as yourself, humbly, willing to learn, basically, and yeah, I mean I think it's healthy to approach humbly, to try to learn about the different trends, learn about different ideas, and to not jump into hardline opinions on things right away. Because, and also to be wary of people that want to draw you in, like, my way is the right way. And there's a lot of that within the Marxist community. A lot of people that are very arrogant in what they believe. And I've been an activist for 20 years, and so it's not just the Marxist community. It's kind of like all of the left. Um, and uh, and I've been a Marxist for a while. I've considered myself a Marxist for a long time. Uh, and and so I've been familiar with Marxism for about 20 years, pretty much since I've become an activist. Uh, and I think it's just important to remain humble and to try to learn. And it's like, and to take things slowly in, kind of with a grain of salt, and do your own research, and to also remain humble enough to where you're taking something in, and it's like, well, that sounds right, and maybe it is right, you know, maybe I like that idea, but just just keep it in the back of your mind that you might be wrong, you know, and if you're humble, uh, then it's like you'll find out that you're wrong about some things, and it won't be a big deal. It's like, I was wrong about those things. I made some mistakes. Here's why. I'm going to try to correct those mistakes. And developing as a political activist is just constant making mistakes and learning how to correct them. And if you're arrogant, it makes it much more difficult to correct your mistakes and to admit that you made mistakes. And so the pattern for people that kind of build that self-importance, that kind of arrogance, is they just continue to make the same mistakes over and over again. There's no self-criticism or self-awareness. And one of the things about this show, when I created it, is I wanted to help other people that are interested in the Marxist community, that are part of the Marxist community, to help to become self-aware, to be more humble, to be able to learn about other trends and ideas and groups, whether they're right or wrong, and so that way we can build a more mature community. Saint Just writes, left and right indeed is oversimplification of politics and economics. The danger of our society isn't always far left or far right, but it can be called middle of the road and simultaneously be neoliberal and thus hurting society. Um, well, it's a little bit of an oversimplification in some ways. Um, right is like the political right, um, is generally characterized by things like austerity, by reaction. So what I mean by reaction is we currently live in like, at least for most of us, like Germany and the United States, most of us that are watching this show on Twitch, we're from imperialist countries. And so basically, the most advanced capitalist countries on the planet. And so the far right generally has a tendency to want to revert back to earlier stages of capitalism, or to even feudal ideas and traditions, and to even roll back the and this is going to sound weird, but even to roll back the more progressive steps in capitalist progress. Like, if, for example, the idea that you should respect black people and people of color and people from all different kinds of nationalities and races and women, and the idea that you should respect the differences in humanity. And this is something that took hundreds of years, even in the capitalist system, to even acknowledge, and I don't mean like it's widely acknowledged. I mean just even to just acknowledge as little as it is today, and to roll that back, And so these would be massive steps back for humanity, and we as humans, we shouldn't want this. We should want to move forward. To me, it's a part of the Marxist tradition to encourage the progress of humanity, to become fraternal and like brothers, communists. And the left, I'll just say the left in general, and I don't mean this is going to be debated, I suppose, but a lot of the left is heavily influenced by the section of the capitalist class that doesn't necessarily want to roll things back or create greater austerity and pressure the workers to the maximum degree and crush them, basically. But it's influenced by the social democratic capitalists. Basically, the capitalists who have basically concluded that it's necessary to bend so that way the entire class doesn't break. So when you're ruling, you can rule with the iron fist of the open hand. And the left is dominated by the bourgeois politics of ruling with the open hand. But uh, I think that for Marxists, we generally reject both, and that our politics are not, well, at least we don't want them to be aligned with bourgeois politics, but with the working class, and the steps that's necessary for the working class to take power instead, not for the ruling class to rule. So, the Weekly Worker. So the Weekly Worker is this is the newspaper of CPGB, the Communist Party of Great Britain. This is, I guess you could call it a Marxist-Leninist organization. It's a very old party. That's about I'd say 100 years old. And the it's an article about the treacherous role of the Tudeh Party in Iran. And so this was a basically a party that had connections with the Soviet Union. And what it did is it entered into a united front with the most extreme Islamists in Iran during the Iranian Revolution. And so a lot of people think the Iranian Revolution, they think of like Khomeini, right? Ayatollah Khomeini and the hardline Islamists. But the revolution wasn't necessarily led by them. It was a massive uprising against the Shah, basically the king, the monarchy of Iran. And so the Tudeh Party was like a social democratic party that allied with the extreme Islamists in the idea that they'd have a united front against the monarchy. And when they made this alliance, they basically backstabbed a lot of other Iranians who were on the left, communists and stuff, and then this, in turn, led to the Islamists gaining the upper hand in the revolution and taking over. It's an interesting piece of history here. And, excuse me, it's on the Weekly Worker. Feel free to check it out. St. Just says, my point is there are political forces that want more capitalism and help big corporations, but call themselves middle and not far right. At least in Germany, like the FDP. Yes, there's always going to be capitalist forces that, of course, want more capitalism and call themselves middle of the road. Generally speaking, again, this is based on my political knowledge and experience, and I think it applies to Germany, it applies to the United States. When you hear like middle or compromise or like bipartisan or that kind of middle of the road political movement, or of bourgeois movement, you're actually hearing the voice of the mainstream capitalist class and their thinkers. So, for example, The Economist is a American capitalist magazine, and I read it from time. It's kind of expensive, but I read it from time to time. I usually read it at like the newsstand. And I recommend other people who are interested in politics to read it. Because if you want to learn about the thinking of the capitalist class, you should learn to read their newspapers, their magazines. You should learn how to read their think tanks. Um, and so Lenin did so, and I encourage it. So anyway, The Economist is like one of these middle of the road publications, and it represents like the mainstream of the capitalist class. It's not Bernie Sanders. It's not the extreme social democrats. They don't want to nationalize everything, and they don't want to give everybody welfare, and they definitely don't want to give everybody a free education and what else, like free healthcare. Um, but then at the same time, they don't want massive austerity. They don't want to take away everybody's pensions. They don't want to destroy all the unions. They don't want to make everybody's minimum wage 5 cents an hour. They want to keep things kind of steady. And so this is like the mainstream of the capitalist class in imperialist countries. The right would be like they want to crush more, they want to take more, far more. There's no reason to give anything, right? And the left, it's like we want to bend more. To bend so we don't break, you know? Let's give the rabble what they need and keep them happy and 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 cut them some crumbs. But yeah, the middle of the road is generally the mainstream of the capitalist class. So that's usually most of the capitalists there. So that's how I would consider that. So Michael Roberts is a Marxist economist. He has an article, I think it's a newer article, and it's on Thomas Piketty. If I don't know if anybody's not familiar with Thomas Piketty. He's a French economist. He wrote Capital. It kind of made waves back about 5 years ago. It was a pretty lengthy book. Um, even though it's the same name as Capital by Karl Marx, it's basically a Keynesian perspective. So it's a kind of a bourgeois economist perspective, a capitalist economist perspective of things. And a lot of Marxists criticized it for not really saying anything new. Like it didn't refute anything that Marx said, and it didn't contribute anything that Marx didn't already say. And in fact, the book, even though it was very long, it basically said a lot less than what Marx had to say in Capital, in Das Kapital. And so anyway, this book is on Piketty, and he talks about it's basically a big critique of Piketty, and talking about Capital. And the new book is called Capital and Ideology, which is even bigger than the first Capital 5 years ago that Piketty wrote. And so this economist, the one who wrote this article, Michael Roberts, he's basically poking holes in things that Piketty wrote, and how there's a lot of mistakes. And I can't get into all the details, but it's pretty interesting. There's also a debate. There was also a debate I saw the other day, but it's in French, with the French economist and Piketty, and poking holes in some of Piketty's arguments. Just like I said earlier, it's important to get familiar with like the capitalist publications, that they use to talk to each other with. It's also important to get familiar with capitalist economists, because these are the people that kind of get the most airtime on TV and radio and whatnot. And members of the Marxist community, we have to be familiar with it so we can refute it, right? Aaron Piketty's kind of has a superstar status right now. Oh yeah, so not quite lastly, but almost lastly, the Socialist Resurgence on Facebook. They have a panel discussion on the French general strikes. This has some comrades from France, some of their comrades from France, in the panel discussion. It's a little bit long, so I'm not going to play the whole thing, but it's worth checking out. I think many of you guys will find it interesting.
Concentrated in the transportation sector to ensure that transportation remained paralyzed and that the workers in the transportation were not isolated by themselves and that we could bring people together.
So as you can see, this is basically like a video conference with comrades in France, and it's translated into English as well.
In interprofessional general assemblies.
These kinds of first-hand accounts, I think, are important to study these situations. So yeah, please check out this panel discussion. To find it, go to Facebook and check out Socialist Resurgence. And they should have it on their page. And since I was muted earlier, I'm just going to go over once again the Cosmonaut article. Jeez, I tried to go over this twice, but I couldn't get the audio working. So this article, this is on cosmonaut.blog. It's called The Need for Agitation Organizations. And Chris Koch basically talks about these different sectarian organizations and how they're failing. The take on the UBI. Can you explain what you mean by the UBI? I'm not familiar with that. Saint Just. And then I'll answer your question after universal basic income. Okay. So no problem. So universal basic income, that's the idea that everybody makes a minimum wage, right? Just for living and breathing. And then there's the answers that Marx gives to today's issues like automation, which actually was a thing when he was alive. And so, because that's actually addressed, I think it's in chapter 16 of Das Kapital. So, I could be wrong. It could be like 17 or 18, but I think it's 16. It's been a while since I've read it. So, the idea of having a universal basic income, it's welfare. It's not bad. I don't think that people who are progressively minded, who care about the working class, who care about the masses and the poor, people in the Marxist community, I don't think we should oppose that. Why should we? It would help. I mean, if it did, if the capitalists want to do that and give a universal basic income or more welfare, we should not oppose it. That would be silly. Of course, we should accept it. But it's not enough. And welfare has a long history of being given when it's convenient, when it's felt like it's absolutely necessary to give welfare, and then taken away when it's convenient. For the best example here in the United States would be like FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who rolled out a ton of welfare programs And many of those programs were basically rolled back over the decades as the capitalist class grew more confident that it was no longer needed to maintain rule. But the welfare programs were rolled out by FDR to begin with during a period when there were thousands of strikes in the United States. And it seemed like the United States was on the verge of having a revolution. So I don't oppose welfare. If the capitalist class wants to give people housing, of course I support that. I'm not going to oppose that. Generally speaking, when they do that, it's not enough. For example, here in Seattle, there's been talks by the capitalist class. We're going to give more housing. The houses they are talking about giving, like the homeless and people without housing, they look like garden sheds for your tools. They call them tiny homes, but they're like garden sheds. Well, of course you can answer that. I'm just gonna keep talking while you answer that, Maxwell. Regarding automation is it was an phenomenon during Marx's time, machinery, and the so basically, capitalists they buy more machinery. The idea of the machinery is that it takes away labor hours because it's more productive than labor, and as automation increases, you have less labor hours, and with technological advancements, you can actually completely eliminate like like a workforce. But as automation is developing, and it's basically taking away from the labor hours, it's also de-skilling the workers. So for example, when you look at the textile workers in like England, the textile workers in the early stages of capitalism were basically very male dominated. So it's a very, very male dominated industry, and it took quite a bit of skill, and so we're gonna and I'm gonna lead into the Luddite rebellion. And so what happened was the capitalists added more machinery. The machinery de-skilled the labor. This allowed for the capitalists to employ women and children who didn't need as many skills, who didn't have as many skills, and so they could employ women and children. And as they employed women and children, the men who were in the textile industry began to lose work, and so out of frustration, they had a rebellion and they started breaking the machines. This rebellion was, of course, failed, but this is the pattern basically. It de-skills the labor. Well, there's no running away from technological advancement or automation. Like capitalism is just always reinventing itself. It's always modernizing and trying to reinvent the labor process to make it more efficient, etc. Last week we talked about the Taylor system and how now we have much more advanced systems than the Taylor system. But yeah, this isn't really something you can run away from. And there's also like the arguments that are really as old as Marx, because it's addressed in Capital, is the arguments like, oh well, if you if you make everybody lose their job because of technology, you're actually creating more jobs, right? But the problem is the people with the old jobs usually have a skill or something, and they're not trained to, or they don't have a skill to do these new jobs. And so what usually happens is they just starve, or they struggle, right? Um, so and also you wouldn't create a machine to basically replace labor hours if that machine required 2 extra labor hours to produce. That doesn't make any sense. Then that machine would not be efficient. It wouldn't be necessary. The whole point of adding in technology as a capitalist, adding in machinery or automation, whether it's robotics or whatever, new tools, is you're trying to reduce the amount of labor hours and the amount of money it costs to produce products. So now, even though we can't really fight it, I mean, I don't think we can fight it. Uh, I've definitely heard lots of complaints. It's definitely a source of agitation for workers, and the longshoremen. A lot of longshoremen have brought it up to me. I know I'm in construction. A lot of construction workers are concerned about automation and how robotics is going to play a role in our industry eventually. Uh, and and really, the idea is, as long as we're in a capitalist system, we're basically at the mercy of the capitalists when they advance automation and machinery, etc. Uh, Under a system that workers control, then that automation is going to be used for our purposes, because it's going to reduce labor hours, so we're not going to stress as much and that kind of thing. And we'll take more of our own value back from the products that we create, you know? And so it depends who's running the system. So just real briefly on this Cosmonaut article, which I'll make it. This will be the last one. Uh, so this article it talks about the different sectarian groups and how they're undemocratic, and namely it points out the ISO, and it argues that basically a lot of the groups that are out there have a petty bourgeois orientation. So like a student and intellectual and small business orientation, and not a workers orientation. They're not. We're not talking about organizations that are filled with workers. And these are supposed Marxist organizations. The author says they're socialist organizations, which I don't is a term I don't agree with. I don't agree with using that term socialist, because I believe that term is it's a bit ambiguous. But anyway, this author says that they need to, like, basically these organizations need to agitate more, and they need to have better agitation, and that agitation of workers is going to help the composition, and that instead these organizations are too focused on leadership. And so I don't agree with that. I don't agree that the present organizations like the ISO and the CWI and the SA are have a focus on leadership, or a priority of leadership. And Yeah, I think they're sadly. I don't think so at all. I think they're not creating real. They're not really building real leaders for the working class. Um, I think uh, a real Marxist organization is going to be democratic. It's going to create real leaders for the working class. It's going to have good agitation. Real leaders will want good agitation. They will create good agitation. Um, and I think it's also going to mean that it will try to connect with all of the elements within the Marxist community and the community that basically is interested in the working class taking power. All of the best and the worst elements, and to try to make something out of it. So I think those are some key differences from the present sectarian organizations that are really dominant, at least here in the United States and Canada. Excuse me. Yeah, and then I talked about this earlier. This is Kshama Sawant. I'll close with this actually. This is Kshama Sawant. I think I was muted. Um, Kshama Sawant. She's the city councilwoman for city of Seattle, and she is with the Socialist Alternative Organization in the United States. And so here she is shaking hands with Bernie Sanders, um, calling him a working class candidate. And one of her supporters, one of the Socialist Alternative supporters, wrote this piece, Jeff Updegrove, and I don't want to pick on him personally too much, but what he's saying is probably what you're going to hear from quite a few Socialist Alternative supporters. And so Shama went to speak at the Tacoma Dome for Bernie. Between something like between 20 and 50,000 people watched it or were in attendance. And uh, and so this supporter says that she gave a message of real revolution, and that she called for the end to capitalist oppression and departure from the Democratic Party and a formation of a new party. Similar left voice, by the way, which says it's very different. And then she explained that running as a Democrat is a strategic error, uh, but that the essay is supporting Sanders in solidarity with his agenda and the people it would serve. Uh, I've got nothing wrong with saying, yeah, Sanders is going to be a much better choice than Trump. I mean, that should be very obvious for working people. Uh, but uh, but to say he's like a working class candidate um, is totally different. Considering he represents a bourgeois party and he's closely connected to the capitalist class. And the other thing is, why is she able to say these things? Like, why is she able to say these things at such a big event? Hey, thanks for watching Just Germany. We'll be on pretty much the same time next week, next Sunday, if you want to take a look. And hopefully all the Skype and the microphone will work and all that. And thanks for letting me know about that. So, so once able to say these things, Bernie Sanders' people know that she's going to say these things. It's not like it's off the cuff or anything. They know that she's going to criticize capitalism, and that she's going to call for socialist revolution, whatever that means, and that she's going to say that we should depart from the Democratic Party. And so my take on this is that um, uh, the calling calling out capitalism. That's something that even capitalists are doing right now, like Nick Hanar. And it's becoming trendy, especially here in Seattle. And calling for a socialist revolution, well, how does that differentiate from Bernie Sanders' revolution? Uh, I don't, I don't think it. She's really made the case of how it's going to be different, or what's going to be so different about it. And then as far as breaking from the Democratic Party, well, I think that is like the long-term trajectory of social democracy. It's going to have to break from the Democratic Party because the Republican Party is kind of going on a trajectory off with Trump. And so it's like if you weren't with Trump, then it's going to be difficult to stay in the Republican Party. And so a lot of the more moderate, by capitalist terms, Republicans are joining the ranks of the Democrats. And the Democrats is just not going to be big enough for both of them. So eventually, the mothership that is the Democratic Party is likely going to, I think it's going to split. I don't think it's going to change. But Sawant is basically like on a leash. She's saying what's acceptable, and she hasn't said anything really that isn't acceptable. So let me read what Max Lightness wrote. He wrote, there's the issue of greed, that when someone gets something that they like, they get addicted to it. Yeah. Yeah, that's true. Greed is addicting. Money's addicting. Um, but yeah, I don't think that that's I don't think that that's going to be a deal breaker necessarily for building a movement, building a community. Anyway, I think that just about wraps up the show. I'm gonna be back on. Hopefully, Andrew will be back next week, 12 p.m. Sunday. Please tune in and check it out. As always, if you have content, you can use the Reddit page to post. If you want us to review something or talk about something, if you have questions, or just talk about the show, please use the Reddit.